The next evening, the loom mill was quiet, the hum of the upgraded systems a faint backdrop to the stillness. Johnny sat on a low workbench near the central console, his magnum resting beside him. The orphan was perched on a stack of old crates nearby, swinging his legs idly as he stared at the glowing call sign on his arm. The two had been sitting in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of recent events hanging over them like an invisible fog. Finally, the orphan broke the quiet, his voice soft but curious. "You ever think about how weird all this is?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the mill, the glowing scanners, and the faintly shimmering timeline map hovering above the console. "Like, one day you're just a normal guy, and then boom, you're fighting monsters and saving timelines." Johnny smirked faintly, leaning back against the workbench. "Weird doesn't even begin to cover it. A few months ago, I was worried about graduating high school. Now I'm trying to figure out how to stop the multiverse from collapsing." The orphan nodded, his youthful face unusually serious. "Yeah, I get that. I mean, I was just a kid trying to stay alive, and then I find out there are infinite versions of me out there, some of them heroes, some of them villains. It messes with your head." Johnny glanced at him, his voice quieter now. "Does it ever bother you, knowing there are so many versions of you, all with their own stories, their own lives? Doesn't it make you wonder who you are in all of this?" The orphan shrugged, though his expression was thoughtful. "At first, yeah. I mean, how do you even make sense of it? But then I realized something, all those other Vandukes, they're not me. Not really. I've got my own story, my own choices to make. That's what matters." Johnny nodded slowly, mulling over the words. "Still, it's a lot to carry, knowing you're part of something so big." The orphan smirked faintly, his tone lightening. "Yeah, well, someone's gotta do it. And hey, at least you've got a team. You've got Ren, Scotty, Shade, they've got your back. That's more than a lot of us can say." Johnny chuckled softly, glancing toward the mill's main room where the others were gathered. "They're a good team. Better than I deserve, sometimes." The orphan tilted his head, his expression curious. "Why do you say that?" Johnny hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Because they didn't ask for this. None of us did. But they're here anyway, fighting alongside me. They could have walked away after the dogman, but they stayed." The orphan leaned forward, his tone more serious now. "You think they stayed just because of you?" Johnny frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The orphan gestured toward the main room. "They stayed because they care. Not just about you, but about what you're all doing here. You're giving them a purpose, Johnny. A reason to fight back against the nightmares. That's not something you take lightly." Johnny looked down at his call sign, the faint glow reflecting in his eyes. I just hope I don't let them down." "You won't," the orphan said firmly. "You've got what it takes. You just need to trust yourself and them." The two sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of their shared understanding settling over them. Finally, Johnny spoke again, his voice softer. "What about you? Do you ever miss your timeline? The life you had before all this?" The orphan's smirk faded, replaced by a wistful expression. "Yeah. Sometimes. I mean, it wasn't much of a life always running, always fighting. But it was mine. You know? It's hard to let go of that." Johnny nodded, his voice steady. "We'll make it worth it. All of this. We'll make it mean something." The orphan smiled faintly, his youthful confidence returning. "Damn right we will." The two sat in the quiet of the mill, the hum of the multiverse around them a steady reminder of the battles ahead. For now, though, they allowed themselves a moment of peace, a brief reprieve before the next storm. Johnny leaned forward on the workbench, the faint hum of the multiverse scanners in the background. The orphan sat across from him, his legs swinging idly from the crate he perched on. Johnny had been thinking about the orphan's story, the man behind the slaughter, the killer animatronics, and the horrors that haunted his timeline. But something had been nagging at him. Johnny finally broke the silence, his tone cautious but curious. "You've mentioned them before, Cassidy, William Afton, the 5 missing kids. But you've never told me their story. Who were they?" The orphan's legs stopped swinging, and he looked down, his expression tightening. For a moment, it seemed like he might brush the question off. But then he sighed, his voice quiet. "It's not a story with a happy ending," he began, his tone measured. "But you should know it. If nothing else, it'll help you understand why my timeline was the way it was." Johnny nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I'm listening." The orphan took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts. "It all started with William Afton. He was brilliant, in a twisted kind of way. A genius engineer, a pioneer in robotics. He co-founded Fazbear Entertainment with his business partner, Henry Emily. Together, they built the first animatronics for a family pizzeria, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. On the surface, it was a place for kids to have fun, eat pizza, and watch the animatronics perform. He paused, his voice hardening. But William Afton wasn't just an inventor. He was a monster. Behind the scenes, he had urges. A need to kill. He used his creations as tools, luring children into the backrooms of the pizzerias and taking their lives. He thought he was untouchable, hiding his crimes behind the smiling faces of Freddy and his friends. Johnny's face darkened. And the 5 missing kids. The orphan nodded grimly. They were his victims. 5 children, taken and murdered in the early days of the pizzeria. Their names were lost to most of the world, But one of them, Cassidy, she didn't just die. She stayed. Stayed? Johnny asked, frowning. The orphan's voice grew quieter. Her spirit lingered. She and the others found their way into the animatronics possessing them, binding themselves to the machines. It wasn't just revenge. It was a curse, a tether they couldn't escape. Cassidy, in particular, was relentless. She hated Afton for what he did, and she made it her mission to make sure he couldn't rest, even in death. Johnny sat back, absorbing the weight of the story. And Afton. The orphan's expression darkened further. He didn't stop. Even after the first 5, he kept killing. More children disappeared, more animatronics became haunted. But Afton was clever. He built a suit spring Bonnie that doubled as a costume. He used it to lure his victims. It was his undoing. One day, the spring locks in the suit failed, crushing him inside. But even that wasn't the end. Johnny's brow furrowed. How could it not be the end? Because Afton didn't die, not completely, the orphan said, his voice filled with bitter anger. The animatronics kept him alive in their own way. His soul was trapped, tethered to the suit. He became something worse than human, a monster that couldn't die, driven by his own twisted will. Over the years, he kept coming back, each time more dangerous than before. Johnny shook his head, his tone incredulous. And Cassidy? The orphan's eyes glinted faintly in the dim light. Cassidy was different. She was the spirit of vengeance. She wouldn't let Afton go, no matter how much time passed. Some timelines called her the one you should not have killed. She made sure Afton stayed trapped, that his suffering never ended. Johnny exhaled, leaning back. And the animatronics. The orphan smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. They became something more than just machines. The spirits inside them gave them purpose, but also pain. They weren't just weapons, they were victims, twisted into tools of fear and violence. I spent years fighting them, trying to survive. Each one had a story, a reason for what they did. But in the end, they were all part of Afton's legacy. The room fell silent, the weight of the orphan's words settling over them like a heavy fog. Johnny finally spoke, his voice quiet. And you stopped him? The orphan nodded slowly. It wasn't easy. It took everything I had. But yet I stopped him. At least, in my timeline. But Afton's like a stain on the multiverse. No matter how many times you kill him, he always finds a way back. Johnny's gaze hardened. Then we'll make sure he doesn't come back here. The orphan's smirk returned, faint but determined. Damn right we will. The orphan fell silent for a moment, his gaze dropping to the ground. The mention of William Afton's name had stirred something deeper, something that tugged at his memories like a frayed thread. He swung his legs slowly, lost in thought, before finally speaking again, his voice softer now. "You know, it wasn't always like that," he said, his tone more reflective. "Afton wasn't always a monster. There was something that pushed him over the edge, a moment that broke him and sent him down that spiral of killing." Johnny leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift in the orphan's demeanor. "What happened?" The orphan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "The bite of 83. It's one of those events that echoes through every timeline tied to Afton. It wasn't just an accident, it was the beginning of everything." Johnny frowned. "The bite of 83. The orphan nodded, his eyes distant. "Back then, Afton had a family. A wife, 2 sons, and a daughter. His youngest son, well, no one knows his name for sure, but he was just a kid. A scared, lonely kid who didn't like the animatronics his father created. They terrified him, especially Fredbear and Spring Bonnie." Johnny's brow furrowed. "Why would they scare him? His father built them. Sometimes the things closest to us are the ones we fear the most," the orphan said quietly. "The kid's older brother was a bully, constantly teasing him, scaring him with the animatronics. One day, during a birthday party at Fredbear's family diner, the older brother and his friends decided to take the teasing too far." Johnny's expression hardened. "What did they do?" The orphan's tone grew heavier. "They grabbed the kid and dragged him toward the stage, where Fredbear was performing. They lifted him up, forced his head inside the animatronic's mouth as a joke. They didn't mean for anything bad to happen, but the animatronic wasn't designed for that. The pressure sensors in the jaw malfunctioned, and it closed hard." Johnny's stomach churned. "And the kid?" The orphan looked away, his voice quiet. "He didn't survive. He was in a coma for a few days, but he never woke up." The weight of the story settled over the room like a heavy fog. Johnny shook his head, trying to process it. "And Afton," he snapped. The orphan nodded slowly. "Losing his son broke him. But it wasn't just grief. He blamed Henry, his business partner, for the malfunction. He blamed his older son for the bullying. And deep down, he probably blamed himself for building the animatronics in the first place. All of that guilt and anger festered inside him, and it twisted him." Johnny's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "So the bite of 83 wasn't just an accident. It was the start of everything." The orphan's gaze returned to Johnny, his eyes filled with a mix of bitterness and understanding. "Exactly. It set off a chain reaction. Afton became obsessed building more animatronics, experimenting with ways to cheat death, and eventually, killing. The bite of 83 wasn't just an accident, it was the spark that lit the fire." Johnny leaned back, his thoughts racing. "And Cassidy? Was she connected to all of this?" The orphan's expression darkened. "Cassidy was another victim, but she was different. She hated Afton more than anyone else. Some say she knew about the bite, that she saw the pain it caused and decided to make Afton pay for everything that came after. Whether it's true or not, one thing's clear: Cassidy was the one who wouldn't let him go, no matter how much time passed. The room fell into silence again, the weight of the orphan's story hanging heavy in the air. Johnny finally broke it, his voice steady. "It sounds like every timeline tied to Afton is cursed." The orphan smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Yeah. But curses can be broken. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that even the darkest stories can have a light at the end if you fight for it." The orphan's thoughtful silence stretched for a moment before he spoke again, his voice quieter, almost reverent. "And then there was Charlotte Emily. She was different from the others. She didn't just become a victim, she became a protector." Johnny tilted his head, intrigued. "Charlotte? Who was she?" The orphan leaned back, his eyes distant as he recalled the story. Charlie was Henry Emily's daughter. Henry, the co-founder of Fazbear Entertainment, was the one who built the original animatronics alongside Afton. But while Afton's creations were designed with darker purposes in mind, Henry's work was pure. He wanted to bring joy, to create something magical. Johnny nodded. "But Afton ruined that, didn't he?" The orphan's expression darkened. "Yeah. Afton saw things differently. To him, the animatronics were tools, means to an end. Henry trusted Afton, believed they were partners, but that trust was misplaced." He paused, his voice lowering. "One night, at one of the original pizzerias, Afton waited in the shadows. Charlie was playing outside, near the security gate. It was locked, and she couldn't get back inside. Afton saw his chance. He approached her, lured her closer, and killed her." Johnny's jaw clenched. "That bastard." The orphan nodded, his tone heavy. "It was cruel, calculated. But what Afton didn't count on was the puppet." Johnny frowned. "The puppet? It was one of Henry's creations," the orphan explained. "Not like the other animatronics, it was meant to be a guardian, something to protect the children who visited the pizzeria. But that night, it failed. It found Charlie's body too late. Its programming kicked in, and in its grief, it did the only thing it could. It took her spirit inside itself, binding her to it." Johnny leaned forward, his expression a mix of shock and curiosity. "So Charlie became the puppet?" The orphan nodded, his gaze steady. "Yeah. Her spirit fused with it, and from that point on, she wasn't just a victim. She became a protector, watching over the other children's spirits and trying to stop Afton's evil. In some timelines, the puppet became the driving force behind freeing the animatronics, giving the other kids a chance at peace." Johnny's brow furrowed. "And Afton? Did he ever figure out what he'd done?" The orphan smirked faintly. Oh, he knew. But by then, he was too far gone to care. All he saw was power, ways to cheat death, ways to exploit the animatronics. He didn't see Charlie as a threat. That was his mistake. Johnny exhaled, shaking his head. So Charlie, she wasn't just a victim. She was a hero. The orphan's expression softened. Yeah. She stood against Afton in ways most people couldn't. Even after death, she kept fighting. In my timeline, she was the one who gave me a chance to stop him. Without her, I wouldn't have survived. Johnny's voice was quieter now, filled with respect. She deserved better. They all did, the orphan said, his tone firm. But Charlie, she never gave up. Even in death, she stood her ground. And because of her, a lot of timelines have hope. Johnny sat back, processing the weight of the story. The loom mill's hum filled the silence as he finally spoke again. So, we fight for them too. For Charlie, Cassidy, and everyone who couldn't fight for themselves. The next morning, the loom mill buzzed with its usual energy as the group gathered around the central console. Shade was the first to notice something off. His fingers flew over the keyboard, his expression tightening as data streamed across the screen. Guys. Shade called out. We've got something weird here. Ren and Scotty stepped up beside him, their curiosity piqued. Johnny and the orphan arrived moments later, Johnny sipping from a cup of coffee as he leaned over Shade's shoulder. What's going on? Johnny asked. Shade pointed to the scanner data. This. According to the system, there's been a displacement anomaly. A whole building is gone. Gone. Ren frowned, her spear resting against her shoulder. What do you mean, gone? Scotty leaned closer, squinting at the screen. It says there's a park there now. A whole park, but was there even a building there to begin with? I don't remember one. Shade shook his head. Neither do I. Ren crossed her arms, glancing at Johnny. Same here. If something was there, you'd think we'd remember it, right? Johnny's brow furrowed as he stared at the data. A memory stirred in the back of his mind, faint but undeniable. He set his coffee down, his voice firm. No. There was definitely a building there. The group turned to look at him, confusion written across their faces. What are you talking about? Scotty asked, his tone skeptical. There's always been a park there. I've been through that area a dozen times. Johnny shook his head, his jaw tightening. You're wrong. It wasn't a park. There was a building, a library. It was old, falling apart, but it was there. I remember going there as a kid. The orphan's gaze sharpened, his arms crossing as he leaned against the console. You're sure? Johnny nodded firmly. Positive. I even remember the layout, dusty shelves, broken windows, that weird statue of an owl by the door. Ren raised an eyebrow, glancing at Shade. Can we check historical records? Maybe this is just some glitch in the scanner. Shade pulled up a local database, cross-referencing the location. According to this, it's been a park for decades. There's no mention of a library. That's impossible, Johnny said, his voice rising slightly. I know it was there. Scotty shrugged, trying to diffuse the tension. Maybe you're just remembering wrong. Happens to everyone. Johnny shot him a sharp look. I'm not remembering wrong. There was a library. I don't know why you guys don't remember it, but I do. The orphan straightened, his expression thoughtful. This could be something bigger. Memory inconsistencies like this aren't normal, not in a single timeline. If Johnny's right and the rest of you are wrong, it means something's been altered. Ren frowned, gripping her spear tightly. Altered how? Like, someone messed with our memories. The orphan nodded. Or reality itself. The multiverse doesn't just bend for no reason. If that building disappeared, it might not just be misplaced, it might have been erased. Johnny's voice grew colder, more determined. Then we need to figure out why. Whatever happened there, it's important. I can feel it. Shade tapped at the console, his expression grim. The scanners can only tell us so much. If we want answers, we're going to have to go there. See it for ourselves. Ren glanced at Johnny, her tone cautious. Are you sure you're ready for that? If the rest of us don't remember this place, there's no telling what else might be waiting for us. Johnny met her gaze, his expression unwavering. I'm sure. If the multiverse is messing with my head, I'm not just going to sit here and let it. We're going to that park. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but no one objected. The orphan grabbed his magnum, checking the chamber before giving Johnny a nod. All right. Let's go. Whatever's out there, we'll face it together. As they geared up and prepared to leave, the tension in the air was palpable. The memory of the library, vivid in Johnny's mind, felt like a tether to something greater, something the multiverse wanted him to forget. But he wasn't going to let it. Whatever was waiting for them at that park, he was determined to uncover the truth. The van pulled to a stop at the edge of the park. The group stepped out cautiously, weapons at the ready, their senses heightened. The orphan's gaze swept across the area, his eyes narrowing as he activated ethereal vision. The park seemed ordinary: manicured grass, scattered benches, and a playground at its center, but the faint hum of multiversal energy vibrated in the air. This place is wrong, Johnny muttered, gripping his magnum tightly. I can feel it. Shade knelt near the ground, holding up a small handheld scanner. The screen flickered as it struggled to process the energy surrounding them. There's definitely multiversal energy here, he said, his tone uneasy. But it's polluted. Like someone tried to force it through a filter it wasn't meant to fit. Ren scanned the perimeter, her spear in hand. Polluted how? Can you pinpoint the source? Shade shook his head, his frustration evident. It's everywhere, spread thin, like it's baked into the air itself. Whatever caused this, it's big. The orphan stepped closer to Johnny, his expression grim. This isn't just an anomaly. Someone or something is deliberately altering reality. And it's not just localized to this park. Before Johnny could respond, the call sign on his arm emitted a sharp beep, followed by a glowing alert on Shade's scanner. The display shifted, highlighting a new location. Another change, Shade said, his voice tight. Lancaster General Hospital. The group froze, turning their attention to the scanner. Ren leaned over Shade's shoulder, her eyes scanning the data. It says, the hospital is now a memorial site. For an accident that destroyed it? Johnny's stomach dropped. What? Scotty frowned, looking over the information. Destroyed? That can't be right. We drove past it last week, it was fine. Shade tapped the console, pulling up more details. The system says it was destroyed on August 8, 2000. Some kind of catastrophic failure. There's a whole record of it, news reports, eyewitness accounts, everything. Johnny's heart raced. August 8, 2000. That's impossible. The hospital was operational literally yesterday. Ren turned to Johnny, her expression confused. Are you sure? Maybe. Johnny cut her off, his voice firm. Yes, I'm sure. That's the hospital I was born in. On August 7, 2000. The day before this so-called accident. The orphan's eyes narrowed, his voice steady but intense. If the hospital was destroyed the day after you were born, then it couldn't have been standing yesterday. Scotty rubbed his temples, his face pale. I don't understand. It feels like the hospital was always gone, but at the same time, I remember seeing it just a few days ago. Ren's hand gripped her spear tightly, her voice filled with frustration. It's like my memories are rewriting themselves. I remember the hospital being a memorial now. But I also remember it being fine. What the hell is going on? Johnny's call sign pulsed faintly, and he looked at it with a growing sense of dread. This isn't just reality changing, it's changing us. Our memories, our perception of what's real, it's all being rewritten. The orphan stepped closer to him, his tone urgent. This is bigger than just a displaced building or a polluted park. Whoever's doing this isn't just altering space, they're rewriting time. And if they're targeting places tied to you, Johnny, this is personal. Ren's expression hardened, her grip on her spear steady. So what do we do? If reality itself is shifting, how do we stop it? Johnny glanced at the park, then back at the scanner. His voice was steady but cold. We start by figuring out who's behind this. Someone or something is pulling these strings. And we're going to find them. Shade straightened, his scanner still buzzing faintly. If these anomalies are connected, there's a pattern. We need to analyze the changes, track the energy, and figure out where it's coming from. The orphan nodded, his gaze fixed on Johnny. Whatever this is, it's not over. And if they're targeting you, they're going to keep escalating. Johnny's grip on his magnum tightened, his jaw clenching. Then we escalate too. Let's get to the hospital and see if there's anything left to uncover. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the unfolding mystery pressing down on them. The park behind them felt colder now, a shadow of something far greater at play. As they loaded back into the van, the hum of multiversal energy vibrated faintly in the air, a reminder that reality itself was no longer safe. Johnny sat in the passenger seat of the van, his eyes locked on the faint glow of the call sign on his arm. The van rumbled softly as they headed toward Lancaster General, or what was left of it. The tension in the air was thick, but Johnny's mind raced with a clarity that made the rest of the world feel distant. The orphan sat in the back, his magnum in his lap, staring out the window. He looked deep in thought, his youthful face set in an expression that didn't match his years. Finally, Johnny broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "The Mothmen," he said. The orphan's head snapped toward him, his eyes narrowing. "What?" Johnny turned slightly, meeting the orphan's gaze. "The Mothmen. All of this, it's him. This happened before in the Hunter's timeline. He told us about it." The others perked up, glancing toward the two Vandukes as if sensing the gravity of the conversation. Scotty frowned. "The Mothmen? Like the cryptid? The guy with wings and glowing red eyes?" Johnny nodded, his tone unwavering. "It's more than a cryptid. The Mothman isn't just some urban legend. He's multiversal. A creature of chaos, bent on destabilizing timelines for his own reasons. And in the Hunter's timeline, he was the original Vandukes' foe. The first one to challenge what we are." The orphan's eyes widened slightly, but then understanding dawned. "History repeating itself," he muttered. "We're a direct spin-off of the Hunter's timeline. It makes sense. If the Mothman destabilized that timeline, he could easily do it here." Ren, gripping her spear tightly, leaned forward. "Hold on. You're saying this thing is targeting us? Why?" Johnny took a deep breath, his voice steady. "Because the Mothman accidentally played a part in creating us. When he threw the first Vanduke into the multiverse, when he destabilized that timeline, the multiverse reacted. Every Vanduke across every timeline got their powers because of that event. We're all connected to the Mothman in some way." The orphan nodded, his voice grim. and he's been after us ever since. It's not just about chaos. It's personal for him. He created his own enemies, the Vandukes, without meaning to, and now he's trying to undo that. Shade adjusted his scanner, his brow furrowed. So these anomalies, the missing buildings, the memory changes, they're his doing. Not directly, Johnny said. The Mothman doesn't work like that. He destabilizes things, causes cracks in timelines, lets the multiverse unravel itself. These changes are the result of his presence, the ripple effects of his interference. Scotty slumped back in his seat, rubbing his face. Great. So we're dealing with a multiversal cryptid that can rewrite reality just by existing. Fantastic. Ren's voice was sharp. If he's responsible, how do we stop him? How do you fight something like that? Johnny and the orphan exchanged a glance, their expressions grim. Finally, the orphan spoke, his tone heavy. You don't fight him outright. Not yet. The Mothman is more than just a creature, he's a force of nature. Fighting him directly is suicide unless you're prepared. Johnny nodded. First, we need to figure out what he's after. If he's here, destabilizing this timeline, there's a reason. He doesn't just show up randomly. The orphan smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. The Mothman's chaos is never random. It's always aimed, always deliberate. And if he's targeting Johnny's memories, it means he sees this timeline as a threat. Ren raised an eyebrow. A threat? To what? To his agenda, Johnny said simply. If this timeline is a spin-off of the Hunters, it might hold the key to undoing the Mothman's chaos. And he knows it. The group fell into silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them like a heavy fog. Finally, Shade broke the quiet, his voice filled with determination. Then we'd better figure out what that key is. If this thing is tied to Johnny, then Lancaster General and whatever happened to it might hold the answers. Johnny tightened his grip on his magnum, his jaw set. Whatever it takes, we'll find those answers. The Mothman played a part in making us what we are, but he's not going to win. Not this time. The orphan's smirk softened into a faint smile, his confidence returning. That's the spirit. Let's make him regret ever starting this mess. As the van continued toward the site of the anomaly, the group braced themselves for what lay ahead. The stakes had never been higher, but for the first time, they felt the threads of the mystery pulling into focus. The Mothman wasn't just a threat, he was the catalyst for everything they had become. And now, it was time to confront the legacy he had left behind. The van's headlights pierced through the dark streets as the group sped toward Lancaster General, or the memorial site that had replaced it. The tension in the air was palpable, each member of the team lost in their thoughts about the Mothman and the strange anomalies. Johnny sat in the passenger seat, his grip tight on the magnum resting in his lap. The orphan was in the back, leaning against the wall of the van, his eyes narrowed in focus. Then it happened. A sudden shadow swept across the road, blotting out the moonlight. The van swerved violently as Scotty shouted, "What the hell was that?" Before anyone could respond, an ear-splitting screech filled the air, and the van lurched to the side. A massive force slammed into the roof, crushing part of it inward. The vehicle flipped, metal screeching as it rolled off the road and into the nearby woods. Sparks flew as it came to a grinding halt on its side. Johnny's head spun as he struggled to free himself from the seat belt. The sound of wings, massive, leathery wings, echoed through the night. He pulled himself free and scrambled out of the shattered windshield, his heart pounding as he looked up. The Mothman was there. It hovered above the wreckage, its glowing red eyes like twin beacons in the dark. Its massive wings beat with an unnatural rhythm, stirring the air around it. Its shadow stretched impossibly far, enveloping the wrecked van and the surrounding woods in an eerie darkness. Johnny staggered to his feet, his magnum in hand. The orphan climbed out from the back of the van, his own magnum raised. Both of them stared at the towering figure before them, their breaths coming in quick, sharp gasps. The Mothman tilted its head, its gaze locking onto Johnny. Its voice was a deep, resonant rumble, more felt than heard. "You should not exist," it said, its tone dripping with malice. Johnny tightened his grip on the magnum, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Yeah, well, you made me, didn't you? So here we are." The Mothman let out another screech, the sound reverberating through the woods. It swooped down, its talons aimed at Johnny. He dove to the side, rolling to his feet and firing a shot. The magnum's multiversal energy burst forth, striking the Mothman in the wing. The creature shrieked but didn't falter. The orphan opened fire next, his shots precise and deliberate. Each one hit its mark, but the Mothman seemed to absorb the impacts, its body shimmering with an unnatural glow. "It's too strong," the orphan shouted, reloading his weapon. "We're barely scratching it." Johnny gritted his teeth, activating ethereal vision. The world around him shifted, and he could see faint fractures in the Mothman's form, weak points. "Aim for the joints," he shouted. "The wings and legs, they're vulnerable." The orphan nodded, adjusting his aim. Both Vandukes moved in tandem, their shots coordinated as they targeted the creature's weak points. The Mothman screeched again, this time in pain, as one of its wings faltered slightly. But the creature wasn't done. It lashed out with a massive claw, swiping at Johnny and sending him flying into a nearby tree. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. "Johnny," the orphan shouted, rushing toward him. The Mothman took advantage of the distraction, its massive form closing the distance in an instant. It grabbed the orphan with one claw, lifting him off the ground. The orphan struggled, firing his magnum point blank into the creature's arm, but it didn't let go. "You are aberrations," the Mothman hissed. "You were not meant to be." Johnny pushed himself to his feet, his vision swimming. His call sign pulsed faintly, feeding him energy as he steadied his aim. He focused on the Mothman's talons, the fractures in its form glowing faintly in his enhanced vision. "Let him go," Johnny shouted, firing. The energy blast struck the Mothman's claw, shattering the fractures. The creature screeched, dropping the orphan as it staggered back. The orphan hit the ground and rolled, coming up with his magnum ready. "We've got to pin it down," the orphan shouted. Johnny nodded, his mind racing. He glanced at the wrecked van, its damaged frame sparking faintly in the dark. "We can use the van." The orphan's eyes widened, then a grin spread across his face. "You're crazy." "I love it." Johnny activated his call sign, channeling energy into his magnum. The orphan did the same, their weapons glowing with multiversal power. Together, they aimed at the van, firing in unison. The energy surged into the wreckage, supercharging it. The van's frame groaned and shifted, the energy transforming it into a makeshift weapon. With a final burst, the van launched forward, slamming into the Mothman and pinning it against a massive tree. The creature screeched, thrashing wildly as it struggled to free itself. Johnny and the orphan approached cautiously, their weapons still raised. The Mothman's glowing eyes burned with rage as it hissed, "You cannot stop me. I am chaos. I am inevitability." Johnny's voice was steady, filled with defiance. "And we're Vandukes. We make chaos afraid of the dark." The orphan grinned, raising his magnum. "You picked the wrong timeline to mess with." The two fired in unison, their shots striking the Mothman's fractured form. The creature let out one final, deafening screech before its body dissolved into a swirling mass of dark energy. Johnny lowered his magnum, his chest heaving. The orphan clapped him on the shoulder, his grin still in place. "Not bad, Johnny. Not bad at all." Johnny smirked faintly, holstering his weapon. "Let's get back to the mill. This fight's just getting started." As the swirling mass of dark energy dissipated, Johnny and the orphan kept their weapons raised, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The eerie silence that followed felt unnatural, almost suffocating. Then, a rustling sound echoed from the shadows of the nearby woods. Johnny tensed, his hand gripping the magnum tightly. "Is it gone?" The orphan's eyes narrowed as he activated ethereal vision. His gaze darted around, searching for the faint fractures of multiversal energy left behind by the Mothman. "No," he muttered. "It's not gone. It's retreating. Regrouping." Above them, a faint rustling turned into the heavy beat of wings. The Mothman emerged from the treetops, its massive form illuminated by the faint moonlight. Its glowing red eyes locked onto them one last time before it screeched and flew off into the night, disappearing over the horizon. Ren and Scotty stumbled out of the wrecked van, their faces pale. "What the hell was that?" Scotty asked, his voice shaky. "The Mothmen," Johnny said grimly. "And it's not done with us." Before anyone could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed through the woods. The group froze, their weapons coming up instinctively. The growl grew louder, joined by others, until it seemed to surround them. Shade checked his scanner, his expression grim. Guys. We've got movement." "A lot of it?" Johnny turned, his ethereal vision flickering on. The woods were alive with faint, shambling figures, dozens of them. Their forms glowed faintly with the same polluted multiversal energy they detected at the park. The orphan cursed under his breath. "Zombies. Great. The Mothman's destabilization is worse than we thought." Scotty's shotgun came up, his voice a mix of panic and disbelief. "Zombies? Are you kidding me?" Ren spun her spear, her stance shifting into a defensive position. "They're not kidding. Look alive, no pun intended." The first figure staggered into the clearing, its decayed form barely holding together. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its movements were erratic but deliberate. Then another appeared, and another, until the woods seemed to churn with the undead. Johnny took a step back, his voice steady but urgent. "These aren't just zombies. There's something worse. That energy, they're tied to the Mothman's destabilization." The orphan nodded, his magnum raised. "Which means they're not just here to wander. They're here to kill." The first zombie lunged, its claw-like hands reaching for Johnny. He fired, the magnum's multiversal energy blast tearing through its chest. The creature collapsed, but more took its place. "Keep moving," Ren shouted, jabbing her spear into the nearest zombie. "Don't let them surround us." Scotty fired his shotgun, the blast taking down two of the creatures at once. "This is insane. How many of these things are there?" Shade, still monitoring the scanner, shouted, "Too many. We need to fall back, regroup at the mill." Johnny fired again, taking down another zombie. "We won't make it to the van. We're on foot from here." Ren spun her spear, clearing a path through the horde. "Then we move fast. Stay close, and don't stop." The group formed a tight circle, their weapons firing in tandem as they pushed through the shambling mass of undead. The growls and snarls of the zombies grew louder, but the group moved with precision, each member covering the others as they made their way through the woods. Johnny's mind raced as he fired shot after shot, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The Mothman's destabilization wasn't just altering buildings and memories, it was bringing the dead to life. If this continued, the entire timeline could collapse. As they reached the edge of the woods, the group paused to catch their breath. The zombies were still coming, but they had bought themselves a brief reprieve. "What now?" Scotty panted, his hands trembling as he reloaded his shotgun. Johnny's gaze hardened, his voice steady. We get back to the mill. We regroup, we rearm, and we figure out how to stop this. The Mothmen might have started this, but we're going to end it. The orphan smirked faintly, his confidence returning. That's the Vanduke way, right? Make the monsters regret showing up. Ren nodded, her spear still ready. Then let's move. We've got a timeline to save. The group pressed on, the distant growls of the undead spurring them forward. The Mothman's chaos had reached a new level, and the stakes had never been higher. But together, they would face whatever came next, and they would fight to make the nightmares afraid of the dark. The group pushed through the woods, the undead closing in from all sides. The faint glow of polluted multiversal energy clung to the zombies like a toxic aura, their snarls and guttural growls echoing through the trees. Johnny raised his magnum, firing again and again, each shot tearing through the shambling creatures. But no matter how many they dropped, more seemed to appear from the shadows. We can't keep running, Johnny shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. We have to end this here. Ren jabbed her spear into a zombie's chest, spinning to strike another. And how do you plan to do that? There's no end to them. The orphan fired his magnum, his movements precise and calculated. They're tied to the Mothman's energy. If we can burn out that energy, we might be able to stop them. Shade, still scanning the area with his portable device, shouted, easier said than done. The energy is spread across the entire area. It's everywhere. Scotty's shotgun barked loudly as he took down a pair of zombies lunging at him. Well, we'd better figure it out fast, or we're the ones who won't make it out of here. Johnny's mind raced, his ethereal vision flickering on as he scanned the area. The zombies glowed faintly with fractures of multiversal energy, and he could see faint threads connecting them, like an invisible web stretching back to a single point deep within the woods. There! Johnny shouted, pointing toward the glowing threads. The energy's coming from that direction. If we take out the source, we take out the zombies. The orphan nodded, his voice sharp. Then let's clear a path. The group tightened their formation, their weapons firing in tandem as they pushed toward the source of the multiversal energy. Ren's spear spun in a blur of motion, cutting through the horde with brutal efficiency. Scotty's shotgun blasted a wide swath through the undead, while Shade used a modified energy pulse device to stagger the creatures long enough for the others to strike. Johnny and the orphan led the charge, their magnums glowing with multiversal energy as they fired at the approaching horde. Each shot was precise, aimed at the glowing fractures in the zombies' forms, reducing them to crumbling, lifeless husks. As they neared the source, the air grew heavier, the oppressive hum of polluted energy vibrating through their bodies. The group broke through the last line of zombies, finding themselves in a clearing dominated by a massive, pulsating sphere of dark energy. The sphere glowed with the same corrupted light that clung to the zombies, its surface rippling like liquid. Shade scanned the sphere, his voice grim. "That's it? That's the source. But it's unstable. If we hit it wrong, it could explode and take us with it." Johnny stepped forward, his grip tightening on his magnum. "Then we hit it right. Everyone, focus your fire. We take this thing out, or none of us make it out of here." The group formed a line, their weapons aimed at the sphere. The orphan smirked, his magnum glowing brightly as he prepared to fire. "Let's make the nightmares regret showing up." Johnny's call sign pulsed as he channeled multiversal energy into his weapon. "On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Fire!" The clearing lit up with a blinding burst of energy as the group unleashed everything they had. The sphere shuddered violently, cracks spreading across its surface as the combined firepower tore through it. The energy within it roared like a living thing, shrieking as it began to collapse in on itself. The zombies in the woods let out one final, guttural growl before crumbling to the ground, their corrupted forms dissolving into ash. The sphere let out a deafening roar, then imploded, sending out a shockwave that knocked the group to the ground. When the dust settled, the clearing was silent. The oppressive hum of multiversal energy was gone, replaced by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Johnny pushed himself to his feet, his magnum still in hand. "Is it over?" Shade scanned the area, his device flickering faintly. "The energy's gone. Whatever was powering the zombies, it's gone too." Ren leaned on her spear, her breathing heavy. "Good. Because I'm about ready to collapse." Scotty slumped against a tree, his shotgun resting on his lap. "I thought zombies were supposed to be slow and stupid. What the hell was that?" The orphan holstered his magnum, his smirk returning. "Welcome to the multiverse. Nothing's ever simple." Johnny nodded, his gaze scanning the clearing one last time. "We stopped the zombies, but this isn't over. The Mothman started this, and he's not done yet. We need to get back to the mill and figure out our next move." The group gathered themselves, their exhaustion palpable but their resolve unbroken. The Mothman's chaos had pushed them to their limits, but they had fought back and won. For now, the nightmare was over, but the war was far from finished. The group trudged through the woods, battered and exhausted, their steps heavy after the chaos of the night. Ren spotted an old pickup truck parked near a dilapidated cabin just off a dirt path. Its paint was chipped and rusted, but it looked functional. "That'll do," Johnny said, gesturing toward it. Scotty raised an eyebrow. "You seriously want to steal a truck now? After everything?" Johnny shot him a tired glare. "Do you want to walk back to the mill?" Scotty sighed, slinging his shotgun over his shoulder. "Fine. Let's just hope it starts." The orphan chuckled faintly, already making his way to the driver's side. Relax, Scotty. It's not stealing, it's borrowing indefinitely. Ren rolled her eyes but didn't argue, leaning against her spear as the orphan hot-wired the truck with practiced ease. The engine roared to life, and the group piled into the cab and the bed, their weapons clattering as they settled in. The drive back to the loom mill was silent, the weight of the night's events pressing down on them. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the road was the only sound as they passed through the darkened streets of Lancaster. The city felt eerily quiet, as if it too had been shaken by the Mothmen's destabilization. When they arrived at the mill, the bio-androids at the entrance didn't even glance up as the group parked the truck haphazardly near the building. They stumbled inside, collapsing into chairs, onto couches, or wherever they could find a spot to rest. Scotty groaned, his head leaning back against a crate. "I'm never leaving this place again. Someone wake me up when the multiverse is fixed." Ren, despite her exhaustion, stood and leaned on her spear. "We don't have time to rest. The Mothman isn't going to stop, and if tonight was any indication, he's getting bolder." Johnny sat at the main console, his magnum resting on the table in front of him. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the fatigue. "She's right. We need to figure out his game, what he wants, why he's targeting this timeline, and how to stop him." The orphan leaned against the console, his arms crossed. "We already know the basics. He thrives on chaos, destabilizes timelines, and leaves destruction in his wake. But there's always a purpose behind it. The Mothman doesn't just wreak havoc for fun." Shade was already pulling up data on the multiversal scanners, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "We can start by analyzing the anomalies. The missing library, the hospital, the zombies, they're all connected somehow." Ren nodded, her tone sharp. "And don't forget the memory changes. If he can rewrite reality like that, there's no telling what else he's altered. We need to be prepared for anything." Scotty groaned again but sat up, reluctantly pulling his scanner from his pack. "Fine. Let's do this. But if zombies show up again, I'm quitting." Johnny smirked faintly, though his expression was serious. "We've faced worse than zombies, Scotty. And we'll face worse again. But we've got one advantage the Mothman doesn't." "And what's that?" Scotty asked, raising an eyebrow. Johnny's gaze hardened, his voice steady. "We're Vandukes. And we don't stop." The orphan grinned, tapping his magnum against the table. "Damn right." The group worked through the night, analyzing data, cross-referencing timelines, and piecing together the threads of the Mothman's game. Each anomaly revealed more clues, but the picture was still incomplete. The Mothman's chaos wasn't random, it was deliberate, calculated. And whatever his ultimate goal was, Johnny knew they had to stop it before it unraveled their timeline completely. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows of the loom mill, the group leaned over the glowing console, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. They were in a fight against chaos itself, and the stakes had never been higher. But for the first time, they felt like they were closing in on the truth. And Johnny knew that with the team by his side, they wouldn't stop until they won. The room was dimly lit by the glow of the multiversal scanners as Johnny and the others gathered around a central console. The orphan sat on a nearby crate, his magnum resting on his knee as he watched Johnny navigate through the VCSN interface. Ren, Shade, and Scotty stood behind him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. "You sure about this?" Ren asked, leaning on her spear. "These logs predate even the original multiversal war. Who knows what's in them?" Johnny glanced at her, his face set with determination. "We need to understand the Mothmen. If these logs have answers, we can't ignore them." Shade nodded, his tone cautious. "Just be ready. These might not be easy to hear." Johnny took a deep breath and activated the log. The VCSN device hummed for a moment before a faint voice, metallic and crackling with age, began to play. VCSN log activated. "Welcome to the Red Rose. Beginning audio log." The group fell silent as the log began to recount a tale that felt both ancient and chillingly immediate. The year is 2021. This is the Hunter Vanduke, logging a major anomaly in Lancaster General Hospital. It's not just another cryptid sighting, this one is different. The Mothman has shown up, and it's rewriting history. The voice paused, heavy with tension, before continuing. The Mothman traveled back to August 8, 2000. I've tracked its movements. It targeted the hospital specifically. What happened there? What I saw? The timeline corrected itself in the most horrifying way possible. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the hunter's words settling over them like a lead blanket. The log continued, the hunter's voice steady but strained, as if reliving a nightmare. It started with the walls. They began to age rapidly. The pristine white halls turned yellow, then brown, as mold spread across every surface. The paint cracked and peeled, revealing the bare, decaying structure beneath. Everything inside began to change. Equipment rusted, monitors fizzled out, and wires melted into unrecognizable sludge. But the worst part was the people. Johnny's stomach tightened as the log's tone darkened. The doctors, nurses, patients, they didn't just die. They dissolved. Flesh turned to liquid, pooling on the floors in grotesque puddles of waste. Bones crumbled into dust. It wasn't just death, it was erasure. Like the universe itself wanted to wipe them away. Scotty swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. This can't be real." The log continued, relentless. "The babies in the maternity ward. God, the sound they made. Their screams were like nothing I've ever heard, pure pain, pure terror. They turned inside out, their tiny bodies shrinking into nothingness as if the universe rejected their very existence. Clothing was eaten away as if by a swarm of invisible insects. Even the strongest fabrics disintegrated in seconds, leaving behind nothing but rotting scraps. Everything, people, objects, the hospital itself collapsed into a pit of rot and death. And then, it was over. The building crumbled, the ground swallowing it whole. Everything was gone. No survivors. No sign it had ever been there. Just a void where the hospital used to stand. The group sat in stunned silence, the horror of the account sinking in. The VCSN log crackled faintly before the hunter's voice returned, quieter now. The Mothmen didn't just kill those people. It destabilized the timeline in such a way that reality itself corrected the anomaly by erasing everything. And now, I'm certain, it's trying to do it again. The log ended with a soft beep, leaving the room silent except for the faint hum of the scanners. Ren gripped her spear tightly, her knuckles white. Scotty stared at the console, his face pale. That can't be true, Scotty muttered. That kind of destruction, that kind of horror. It's true, the orphan said quietly, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. I've seen similar things in my timeline. When the multiverse decides something doesn't belong, it doesn't just kill, it obliterates. Shade rubbed his temples, his voice tense. If the Mothman's targeting the hospital here, it could be trying to recreate what happened in the Hunter's timeline. But why? What does it gain from this? Johnny stared at the screen, his jaw tight. It's not about gain. It's about chaos. The Mothman doesn't need a reason, it thrives on destabilization, on unraveling timelines piece by piece. But this time, it won't get the chance. The group sat quietly in the Loom Mill's central control room, the atmosphere tense with anticipation. Johnny navigated the VCSN interface, pulling up a series of old, encrypted audio logs, files that predated the multiversal wars and the creation of the call sign network itself. As the files loaded, the faint hum of the Loom Mill's newly upgraded systems filled the silence. Finally, the first log played. VCSN audio log activated. Welcome to the Red Rose. Beginning audio log. The voice was soft but firm, a version of Vanduke they had never heard before. Before the wars, before the call sign network, there was only us, a scattered few across a sea of timelines. We had no name, no unity, only our strange connection to Lancaster County and the multiverse itself. My name is Bradley Eshelman, though some call me Johnny Vanduke. This is the story of the days before the network. The log shifted, detailing the original appearance of the Mothmen in the Hunter's timeline. The descriptions painted a vivid, horrifying picture. It began in Lancaster, 2021. But the Mothmen didn't stay there, it reached back to August 8, 2000, targeting Lancaster General Hospital. What followed was chaos. The walls aged rapidly, cracking and molding in minutes. The ceiling collapsed inwards, and everything inside, people, machines, even the air seemed to decay. I was there. I saw the horror. Flesh melted into viscous puddles, organs dissolving into unrecognizable waste. Clothing disintegrated, babies in the nursery screamed as their bodies twisted and shrank into nothingness. The building itself collapsed, taking with it hundreds of lives. The timeline corrected itself in the most gruesome way imaginable. Scotty shuddered. What the hell? This isn't just history. This is nightmare fuel. The orphan leaned forward, his expression dark. This is what the Mothman does. It destabilizes time and space, forcing the multiverse to clean up its mess. And the cleanup is always catastrophic. As the logs continued, the group uncovered more about life before the network. In those days, we were solitary. Each Vanduk fought their own battles against cryptids, legends, monsters, and worse. The Mothman was only the first. We had no way of communicating, no way of sharing knowledge or resources. Every victory was hard fought and isolated. Every loss was devastating. Then came the man from Vault 717, the first Vanduk to truly wander the multiverse. It was his vision that led to the creation of the call sign network. 30 of us came together, united by a common cause, to monitor, protect, and preserve the multiverse. But before the network, there was only chaos. The logs delved deeper, revealing the origins of the Vanduk identity. We didn't choose this. The multiverse chose us. Each of us tied to Lancaster County in some way, each of us drawn to the loom mill. Even before it became our base of operations, it was a nexus, a place that called to us across timelines. It wasn't just chance. It was fate. The final log ended with a chilling revelation. The Mothman wasn't just a foe. It was the catalyst for everything. Its destabilization of timelines forced us to act, to come together. Without it, there would be no network, no unified Vandukes. But its work isn't done. It's still out there, lurking, waiting to tear apart everything we built. As the audio log ended, the room fell into silence. Ren was the first to speak. This changes everything. The Mothman isn't just a threat. It's the reason we're here. Johnny nodded, his expression grim. And it's still out there, trying to finish what it started. Shade leaned over the console. We need more information. If these logs existed, there might be more hidden data. Something that can give us an edge. Johnny looked at the glowing interface. Then we keep digging. If the Mothman was the beginning, we need to understand every detail, every clue before it ends us. Ren looked at him, her eyes sharp. What's the plan? Johnny stood, his magnum in hand, the glow of the call sign on his arm steady. We stop it before it can finish what it started. We figure out why it's targeting the hospital and we make sure history doesn't repeat itself." The orphan grinned faintly, his youthful confidence cutting through the tension. "That's the Vanduke spirit. Let's make the Mothmen regret ever showing up." The group nodded, their fear tempered by resolve. The horrors of the past echoed in their minds, but they were determined to ensure they would not become the horrors of their future. The fight against chaos had just begun, and they weren't backing down. Johnny froze as the realization struck him, the glow of the console reflecting in his eyes. His mind raced as he pieced together the implications of what he had just heard. "The hunter beat the Mothmen before the network existed," he said aloud, his voice gaining momentum. "That means, with the call sign network, we have something he didn't. We have an edge." The orphan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." Johnny turned to the group, his determination palpable. "The call sign network is multiversal. It connects timelines, anchors them, stabilizes them. What if we used it not just to monitor the Mothman's chaos, but to trap it?" Shade leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "You're saying we could contain the Mothmen? Lock it inside the network?" Johnny nodded, his thoughts clicking into place. "Exactly. The network isn't just a communication system. It's a multiversal web, a net. If we can lure the Mothmen into a controlled area, we can use the network to isolate it, sever its connection to the timelines it's destabilizing." Ren tilted her head, her spear resting against her shoulder. "And how do you plan to do that? The Mothman isn't exactly the type to walk into a trap willingly." The orphan grinned, catching on to Johnny's idea. "We don't make it walk into the trap. We force it?" Scotty looked skeptical. "Force it? You're talking about one of the most chaotic entities in the multiverse. How do you force something like that into a trap?" Johnny's gaze hardened. "We give it what it wants, chaos. The Mothman thrives on destabilization, right? We create an anomaly big enough to draw it in, but one we can control. Once it's inside, we trigger the network to seal it." Shade frowned, considering the logistics. "That's ambitious. The network is powerful, but it's not designed to contain something like the Mothmen. We'd need to reprogram it, strengthen its core to handle that level of energy." Johnny nodded. "Then we start now. Shade, Ren, and Scotty, work on reinforcing the network's stability protocols. Orphan and I will focus on finding a location for the trap somewhere we can control the environment completely." The orphan leaned back, his grin widening. "You've got guts, Johnny. I'll give you that. This could work." Ren crossed her arms, her expression skeptical but thoughtful. "It's risky. If the network fails, we're giving the Mothman exactly what it wants: more chaos." Johnny met her gaze, his voice steady. "We don't have a choice. If we don't stop the Mothman now, It'll keep destabilizing timelines until there's nothing left. Scotty sighed, running a hand through his hair. I can't believe I'm saying this, but let's do it. Let's trap a freaking multiversal nightmare. Shade was already typing furiously at the console. We'll need to map out the network's core, reroute its energy flow, and create a containment algorithm. This is going to take everything we've got. The orphan clapped his hands together, his excitement evident. Then let's get to work. The Mothman doesn't know what it's in for. As the group scattered to their tasks, the loom mill buzzed with renewed energy. The plan was ambitious, dangerous, and unprecedented, but it was their best shot. For the first time, they felt like they had a chance not just to fight the Mothman, but to end its chaos once and for all. Johnny stood at the console, his call sign glowing faintly as he reviewed the data. The network was their greatest weapon, a tool the hunter hadn't had in his time. With it, they could turn the tables on the Mothman. We're not just surviving anymore, Johnny muttered to himself, his voice filled with resolve. We're taking back control. The loom mill buzzed with focused energy as each member of the group threw themselves into their assigned tasks. Johnny paced near the central console, the glow of his call sign steady as he scanned through multiversal data feeds and anomalies. The orphan sat nearby, cross-referencing potential trap locations with old VCSN logs. Shade worked tirelessly at the terminal, his fingers flying over the keyboard as lines of code scrolled rapidly across the screen. Ren stood nearby, her spear leaning against her chair, flipping through scavenged notebooks and handwritten schematics of the network's core. Scotty, despite his usual reluctance, was busy helping Shade map out potential power reinforcements for the network. This is insane, Scotty muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. We're literally reprogramming a multiversal web to hold something that exists to break timelines. And that's why it's going to work, Shade replied without looking up. The Mothman won't see it coming. It's never faced anything like this before. Johnny stopped pacing and turned toward the group. What's the progress on the network enhancements? Shade leaned back, running a hand through his hair. We've reinforced the core stability protocols and rerouted power from the less active nodes to focus on the containment algorithm. But it's still not enough. Ren raised an eyebrow. What do you mean, not enough? Shade sighed, gesturing to the screen. The Mothman's energy is like nothing we've ever dealt with. It's raw chaos. If we're going to contain it, we need a way to counteract that energy, directly neutralize it, or at least dampen it enough for the network to hold. Johnny frowned, his mind racing. Neutralize multiversal chaos? How? The orphan smirked, tilting his head. What about you, Johnny? Your call sign is directly connected to the network. If you can channel multiversal energy into your magnum, what's stopping you from doing the same for the network? Johnny hesitated, the weight of the suggestion sinking in. You're saying I act as the conduit? feed my energy into the network to stabilize it? The orphan shrugged. It's risky, sure. But you've done crazier things. Ren stood, crossing her arms. That's not just risky, it's dangerous. If Johnny overloads the network, it could collapse entirely. And if the Mothman's inside when that happens, we're looking at a multiversal catastrophe. Johnny met her gaze, his expression firm. And if we don't do this, the Mothman keeps tearing apart timelines. We don't have a choice. Shade nodded reluctantly. It's possible, but we'd have to reconfigure the core interface to handle direct input from a call sign. It'll take time. Then let's start now, Johnny said. Orphan, keep working on pinpointing the best location for the trap. Ren, Scotty, help Shade with the reconfiguration. I'll prep the network's containment algorithms. The group nodded, each of them diving back into their tasks with renewed urgency. The stakes were higher than ever, but the plan was taking shape. Hours later, the group reconvened around the central console. The orphan tapped a map of Lancaster County, highlighting a location deep in the woods near the ruins of the old hospital. This is it, he said. The perfect spot. Isolated, tons of ambient multiversal energy thanks to the hospital's collapse, and far enough from civilians to avoid collateral damage. Shade nodded, glancing at the map. It's risky, but it checks all the boxes. We can set up the trap here. Johnny folded his arms, his gaze hardening. Then it settled. We move out at first light. Set the trap, lure the Mothman in, and lock it down. Scotty frowned, shifting uncomfortably. And if it doesn't work? Johnny's expression didn't waver. It will. The orphan grinned, spinning his magnum in his hand. Damn right it will. And when it's over, the Mothman's going to learn what happens when it messes with Vandukes. Ren picked up her spear, her confidence returning. Let's make it afraid of the dark. As the group finalized their preparations, the loom mill buzzed with a mix of determination and tension. The Mothman had been a shadow over their timeline for too long, but now, they had a chance to fight back. To trap the chaos and reclaim their reality. Johnny stood at the console, staring at the map and the glowing interface of the call sign network. The plan was ambitious, dangerous, and unlike anything they'd ever attempted, but it was their only shot. This ends tomorrow, he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. One way or another. The next morning, the group moved with grim efficiency, packing their gear into the stolen pickup truck. The tension was palpable as they loaded weapons, scanners, and the modified components for the call sign network's containment array. Johnny stood by the truck, checking his magnum and adjusting his call sign settings for direct interface with the network. The orphan leaned against the bed of the truck, spinning his magnum idly. You ready for this, Johnny? Once we start, there's no turning back. Johnny met his gaze, his expression unwavering. "We've got one shot to trap the Mothman. I'm not letting it slip away." Ren secured her spear to her pack, her movements precise. "Let's make sure we're not walking into a disaster. If something goes wrong, we need contingencies." Shade climbed into the passenger seat, a bundle of wires and devices in his lap. "The network's ready as it'll ever be. The containment algorithm's solid, but the success depends on Johnny's ability to stabilize the energy. If anything goes wrong, well, we'll be improvising." Scotty groaned as he climbed into the back. "Great. Love a good make it up as we go plan." The orphan slapped Scotty on the shoulder, grinning. "Relax. We've got this. Just don't miss when the chaos starts." Johnny climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly. "All right. Let's do this." The drive to the trap site was quiet, the weight of what they were about to do settling over the group. The pickup rumbled down the dirt path, the ruins of the old hospital looming in the distance. The area felt heavy, the residual energy from the Mothman's past destabilization hanging in the air like a storm cloud. They stopped near the clearing, unloading the gear quickly. Shade and Scotty set up the containment nodes, their movements precise despite the tension. Ren stood guard, her spear at the ready, scanning the perimeter for any signs of movement. The orphan and Johnny worked together to calibrate the network interface. The modified call sign glowed faintly on Johnny's arm, its connection to the containment array humming with energy. "This is it," Shade said, stepping back from the console. "Once we activate the array, it'll start drawing the Mothmen in. But remember, the energy will spike fast. Johnny, you'll need to stabilize it the moment it starts, or the entire system could overload." Johnny nodded, his jaw tight. "Understood." The orphan checked his weapon, his grin replaced by a more serious expression. "And when the Mothman shows up, we hit it hard. Keep it distracted long enough for the network to seal it." Scotty fidgeted nervously, his shotgun resting on his lap. "And if it doesn't work?" Ren shot him a sharp look. "It'll work." Johnny stepped forward, his voice steady. "Let's get it done. Shade, start the array." Shade hesitated for a moment, then pressed a series of commands on the console. The containment nodes lit up, glowing with multiversal energy as the network's web began to spread. The air crackled with tension, the hum of the array growing louder with each passing second. The first sign of the Mothman's arrival was a deep, resonant screech that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground trembled, and the shadows around them began to stretch and twist unnaturally. "It's here," Ren said, gripping her spear tightly. Above them, the sky darkened as the Mothman descended, its massive form blotting out the sun. Its glowing red eyes locked onto the group, and it let out another screech, shaking the air around them. Johnny stepped forward, his magnum glowing with multiversal energy. come and get it." The Mothman lunged, its claws tearing through the air as it charged toward Johnny. He fired, the blast striking its chest and staggering it momentarily. The orphan joined in, his shots precise as he targeted the fractures in the creature's form. The containment array pulsed, drawing the Mothman closer with each wave of energy. The creature thrashed, its wings beating furiously as it tried to resist the pull. "It's working," Shade shouted over the chaos. "Keep it distracted." Ren and Scotty joined the fight, their movements coordinated as they attacked the Mothman from different angles. The creature roared, its claws slicing through the air as it lashed out at the group. Johnny's call sign glowed brighter as he activated the stabilization protocol. The network's energy surged, the containment nodes pulsing in unison as they began to close around the Mothman. "Hold it steady," Shade shouted, his fingers flying over the console. Johnny gritted his teeth, focusing all his energy on the call sign. The network's hum grew louder, the web tightening around the Mothman as it let out a deafening screech. The orphan fired one last shot, hitting the Mothman in its fractured wing. "Now, Johnny. Lock it down." Johnny activated the final command, the containment array glowing with blinding light as it sealed the Mothman within the network. The creature's screeches echoed into silence as the energy subsided, leaving the group standing in the clearing, their breaths heavy. "It's done," Shade said, his voice filled with relief. "The Mothman is contained." Johnny lowered his magnum, his call sign dimming as he exhaled. "For now." The orphan smirked, holstering his weapon. "Not bad, Johnny. Not bad at all." The group stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their victory settling in. The Mothman was trapped, its chaos halted at least for the time being. But they all knew this was just the beginning. The multiverse had more battles to come, and they would be ready. As the glow of the containment array faded, the group slowly began to gather themselves. The clearing was quiet now, the oppressive weight of the Mothman's presence gone. But the air still hummed faintly with residual energy, a reminder of the chaos they had just faced. Johnny holstered his magnum, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "It's contained," he said, his voice steady but tired. "For now." Shade approached the console, checking the readings on the containment array. "The network's holding. The Mothman's energy is stabilized within the core. It's not going anywhere unless something disrupts the system." Ren wiped the sweat from her brow, her spear resting against her shoulder. "Let's make sure that doesn't happen. We just fought a multiversal nightmare I don't want around too." The orphan leaned against a nearby tree, spinning his magnum idly. "Not bad, Johnny. You pulled it off. The hunter would be impressed." Johnny glanced at him, his expression unreadable. The hunter beat the Mothman without the network. We had an advantage he didn't. This fight isn't over not until we figure out what the Mothman was really after. Scotty slumped onto a nearby rock, his shotgun resting on his lap. Do we really need to figure that out? Can't we just leave it locked up and call it a win? Shade shook his head, his tone serious. The Mothman doesn't just act randomly. If it's been targeting this timeline, there's a reason. And if we don't figure it out, we're leaving ourselves open to more chaos. Johnny nodded, his determination returning. Exactly. The Mothman's been destabilizing this timeline for a reason. We need to dig deeper, find out what it was trying to achieve and make sure it can't finish the job. The group fell into a brief silence, the enormity of their task weighing on them. Finally, Ren spoke up, her voice steady. So what's next? We've got the Mothman contained, but we're not exactly out of the woods. Johnny turned to Shade. Can the network hold it indefinitely? Shade hesitated, then nodded. Theoretically, yes. But we'll need to monitor it constantly. The energy levels are stable for now, but if the Mothman starts pushing against the containment field, we'll need to reinforce it. The orphan grinned, his youthful confidence cutting through the tension. Good thing you've got me sticking around, then. Monitoring a multiversal cryptid sounds like my kind of fun. Johnny allowed himself a faint smirk before his expression turned serious again. We'll split our focus. Shade, Scotty, and Ren, you'll keep an eye on the containment field. Orphan and I will start going through the network logs. There's got to be something in there that explains what the Mothman was after. Ren tilted her head, her tone cautious. And if we don't find anything? Johnny's gaze hardened. Then we dig deeper. This isn't just about the Mothman, it's about the multiverse itself. If something this powerful is trying to destabilize timelines, there's a bigger picture we're not seeing yet. Scotty groaned, rubbing his temples. Great. More digging, more chaos, more nightmares. Why'd I sign up for this again? The orphan smirked, clapping him on the shoulder. Because you're part of the team, Scotty. And because deep down, you love this stuff. Scotty muttered something under his breath, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Johnny stepped toward the console, his call sign glowing faintly as he activated the network's interface. The glowing web of timelines appeared before them, a dizzying display of connections, anomalies, and data points. He focused on the threads tied to the Mothman, narrowing the search to Lancaster and the recent destabilizations. Let's get to work, Johnny said, his voice filled with resolve. We've got a multiverse to protect. The group nodded, their exhaustion replaced by determination. The battle against the Mothman was just the beginning. The loom mill buzzed with renewed purpose as the team prepared for the next phase of their mission, uncovering the truth behind the chaos and ensuring the nightmares stayed locked in the dark. Johnny stared at the network interface, his call sign glowing faintly as he scanned the data. His brow furrowed as a grim realization began to form. The others gathered around, their expressions tense as they waited for him to speak. "The Mothman's trapped," Johnny said slowly, "but the timeline is still destabilizing. That means it brought something else with it." Shade tapped furiously at the console, overlaying the network's containment field with a map of Lancaster County. His expression darkened as he pointed to a pulsing red beacon in the center of the city. "Here. Energy is gathering in downtown Lancaster. It's massive, way bigger than anything the Mothman itself could generate on its own." Ren leaned over the map, her spear at her side. "The focal point," she muttered. "The multiversal nexus. The Mothman must have corrupted it somehow." Johnny nodded, his voice steady but cold. "If it's targeting the focal point, that explains the timeline destabilizations. Lancaster is the anchor for this timeline, maybe even the entire multiversal web. If the nexus collapses, it'll tear everything apart." Scotty looked pale as he glanced between the map and Johnny. "And we're just now noticing this? How do we even fix something like that?" Shade zoomed in on the map, highlighting additional energy spikes radiating outward from the nexus. His voice was grim. "It gets worse. Look here, here, and here. These spikes, there's more of them. They're not random." The orphan's eyes narrowed as he followed the data. "Those aren't just energy spikes. Those are monsters." Ren's grip on her spear tightened. "Monsters? As in plural?" Shade nodded, overlaying additional data. The glowing points on the map resolved into faint shapes, twisted, chaotic forms that radiated multiversal energy. Not just any monsters. These are cryptids, urban legends, things that shouldn't exist. And they're not alone. The room fell into stunned silence as another shape appeared on the map, a cluster of glowing red marks surrounding the nexus. The orphan leaned forward, his voice low. "More Mothmen." Johnny's jaw clenched, his fists tightening. "How many?" Shade ran the calculations, his expression grim. "At least 6, maybe more. They're smaller than the one we trapped, but they're just as dangerous. And they're converging on the focal point." Ren's voice was sharp. "So, what's the plan? We can't let them destroy the nexus." Johnny turned to the group, his gaze steady. "We split up. The Mothmen are priority 1. If they've corrupted the focal point, we need to take them down before the damage spreads any further." The orphan grinned, his magnum already in his hand. "Now we're talking. I'll take a couple of the smaller ones. Give me Ren and Scotty for backup." Ren smirked, spinning her spear. "You've got it?" Shade adjusted his gear, his voice practical. "I'll stay here and monitor the containment field on the original Mothman. If it starts pushing back, we'll need to reinforce it." Johnny nodded. "Good. I'll take the lead on the focal point. Whatever the Mothman corrupted, we need to find it and fix it fast." "Shade, Keep us updated in real time." Scotty groaned as he loaded his shotgun. Monsters, Mothmen, and a collapsing timeline. Just another day at the office. The orphan clapped him on the shoulder, grinning. "Welcome to the multiverse, Scotty. It only gets weirder from here." Johnny grabbed his magnum, his call sign glowing brighter as he activated the map's tactical overlay. "All right, let's move. We take down the Mothmen, stabilize the Nexus, and fix this timeline. No matter what it takes." The group exchanged determined glances before splitting off into their respective teams. The loom mill buzzed with urgency as they prepared for the fight of their lives. The Mothmen's chaos had escalated, but they were ready to face it head-on. For Lancaster, for the timeline, and for the multiverse itself, they would not back down. Johnny stepped out into the cool night air, his magnum glowing faintly in his hand. As he stared toward the city, he could feel the weight of the battle ahead pressing down on him. But he wasn't afraid. "We're coming for you," he muttered, his voice low but fierce. "And this time, you're not getting away." Johnny stood in the dimly lit loom mill, his call sign glowing faintly as he stared at the tactical overlay on the console. His jaw tightened as he turned to the group, his voice steady but resolute. "I'm calling in the hunter," he said. "If anyone knows how to deal with a swarm of Mothmen, it's him. He beat one before, and he's the best tracker we've got." The orphan smirked, leaning against a nearby crate. "If we're bringing in backup, let's do it right. I'm calling in Street Rat and Fallout Boy. Those two know how to handle chaos, and right now, we've got plenty of it." Ren raised an eyebrow, her spear resting against her shoulder. "3 more Vandukes? This place is going to get crowded." Scotty groaned, loading his shotgun. "Crowded with Vandukes means crowded with trouble. Are you sure this is a good idea?" Johnny shot him a sharp look. "This isn't just a good idea, it's our only option. If we don't take down those Mothmen and stabilize the Nexus, this timeline is finished." The orphan tapped his call sign, the faint hum of multiversal energy filling the room. "I'll send a message. Street Rat's been itching for a fight, and Fallout Boy's always ready to throw down. They'll be here as soon as the signal reaches them." Johnny nodded, his gaze shifting back to the map. "Good. We're going to need every advantage we can get." Moments later, the loom mill's central console flared with energy as the call sign network activated. 3 glowing symbols appeared on the screen, each one pulsing faintly. The air grew heavy, the multiversal hum intensifying as portals began to open near the edge of the room. The first to step through was the hunter. His presence was commanding, his weathered coat trailing behind him as he adjusted the strap of his crossbow. His sharp eyes scanned the room, locking onto Johnny. "Heard you've got a Mothman problem." The second portal shimmered, and Street Rat emerged, his lean frame clad in patched leather and scavenged gear. He flashed a cocky grin, twirling a knife in his hand. Mothman, huh? Sounds like fun. Finally, Fallout Boy stepped through, his radiation-scarred armor glinting faintly in the mill's light. His heavy boots echoed as he approached, his voice a low rumble. "You've got my attention. What's the mission?" Johnny stepped forward, meeting the gaze of each Vanduke in turn. "We've trapped the main Mothman, but the timeline is still destabilizing. The Nexus in downtown Lancaster has been corrupted, and there are more Mothmen converging on it. Monsters are popping up everywhere, and if we don't stop them, this timeline collapses." The hunter folded his arms, his expression grim. Corrupting a Nexus is no small feat. The Mothman's not acting alone, it's using the monsters to amplify the chaos. Street Rat grinned, flipping his knife. "Monsters, Mothmen, and a crumbling timeline? Sounds like my kind of party." Fallout Boy adjusted the straps on his armor, his voice steady. "What's the plan?" Johnny turned to the tactical map, highlighting the Nexus and the surrounding energy spikes. "We split into teams. The Hunter and Street Rat will track down the smaller Mothmen and take them out. Fallout Boy, you're with me. We're heading to the Nexus to stabilize it and figure out what's causing the corruption." The orphan smirked, spinning his magnum. "And I'll stick with Ren and Scotty. We'll handle the monsters spreading through the city. Someone's got to keep the streets clear." The hunter nodded, his voice firm. "Good plan. Quick, decisive, and with enough firepower to get the job done." Johnny met his gaze, his expression determined. "This isn't just about saving the timeline. This is about sending a message. The Mothman's chaos ends here." Street Rat chuckled, his grin widening. "Let's make them regret showing up." Fallout Boy's heavy footsteps echoed as he stepped toward the exit. "I'm ready when you are." Johnny tightened his grip on his magnum, his call sign glowing brighter. "Then let's move. This timeline isn't going to save itself." As the group dispersed, the loom mill buzzed with energy and purpose. The stakes had never been higher, but with the combined strength of the Vandukes, they were ready to face whatever the Mothman and its chaos could throw at them. For the timeline, for the multiverse, and for their very existence, they would fight and they would win. As the team geared up to leave the loom mill, the air grew heavy, charged with an energy none of them could immediately place. Johnny stopped in his tracks, his call sign glowing faintly in response to something unseen. The orphan, halfway to the exit, turned, his grip tightening on his magnum. "What now?" Ren asked, her spear at the ready. The room fell silent as a soft hum filled the air. Then, in the corner of the mill, a faint shimmer appeared, growing brighter until a figure stepped through. The glow dissipated, leaving a presence unlike any they had encountered before. The man who emerged had an aura of timelessness about him. His cloak was woven with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change, like threads of countless stories entwining. His face was weathered but kind, his eyes holding a depth of knowledge that felt infinite. He carried a staff, its top adorned with a glowing orb that pulsed faintly with multiversal energy. The orphan's eyes widened. No way. Johnny took a step forward, his voice cautious but steady. Who are you? The man smiled faintly, his voice resonating with a strange warmth. I am the original storyteller. The first of our kind. The room fell into stunned silence as the weight of his words sank in. Even the seasoned Vandukes hunter, street rat, and Fallout boy seemed taken aback. Johnny's jaw tightened. The original storyteller? The one who started it all, the storyteller finished, his tone calm but purposeful. Yes. I am the first. The one who chronicled the multiverse before there was a network, before there was unity. The orphan stepped closer, his youthful confidence faltering slightly. You're supposed to be a myth. A legend we told ourselves to make sense of the chaos. The storyteller chuckled softly, his gaze sweeping across the group. I am no myth, young one. I am as real as the chaos you face now. And I am here because your fight is not just against the Mothmen, it is against something much larger. Johnny frowned, his grip tightening on his magnum. Larger? The timeline is destabilizing because of the Mothman and its corruption. What could be bigger than that? The storyteller's expression turned serious, his voice lowering. The Mothman is but a symptom of a deeper wound. The nexus you are racing to protect is the heart of this timeline. Yes, but it has been corrupted not only by the Mothmen but by forces far older and far darker. Ren stepped forward, her spear still at her side. You're saying this isn't just about the Mothmen? The storyteller nodded. Precisely. The Mothman is a harbinger, a pawn of chaos. But the Nexus was not chosen by accident. Someone is pulling the strings. The same force that has destabilized countless timelines before yours. Street Rat raised an eyebrow, flipping his knife absently. Let me guess. Another grand multiversal threat that's going to make our lives hell. The storyteller's gaze sharpened, his voice steady. It is a threat, yes. But not one you face alone. That is why I am here. To guide you, to ensure you do not repeat the mistakes of the past. Johnny stepped closer, his call sign pulsing faintly. You said you started it all. If you're the original storyteller, why are you only showing up now? The storyteller's eyes met Johnny's, his voice filled with quiet resolve. Because now, the stakes are higher than they have ever been. The Mothman's corruption is but the beginning. If you do not act swiftly and decisively, this timeline and every connected timeline will fall. The room grew silent again, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them. Hunter broke the silence, his voice steady. So what do we do? The storyteller smiled faintly. You do what you have always done. Fight. protect, preserve. But now, you do so with the knowledge that this is more than a battle for your timeline, it is a battle for the multiverse itself. He stepped forward, placing a hand on Johnny's shoulder. You, Johnny Vanduke, are more than you realize. You carry within you the strength of countless stories, countless lives. And now, you must rise to meet your destiny. Johnny swallowed hard, the weight of the words settling over him. I won't let this timeline fall. Whatever it takes. The storyteller nodded, his expression filled with quiet pride. Good. Then let us begin. As the original storyteller joined their ranks, the room felt charged with a new sense of purpose. The battle ahead was more daunting than any of them had imagined, but with their combined strength and the guidance of the one who had started it all, they were ready to face the chaos. Together, they would protect the Nexus, stabilize the timeline, and ensure that the multiverse story continued. The loom mill roared to life with energy as the team prepared for what lay ahead. The air hummed with the power of multiversal determination, weapons loaded, scanners calibrated, and every member of the group steeling themselves for the war that awaited them. Johnny stood at the center of the control room, his call sign glowing like a beacon as he addressed the group. His voice was steady, filled with the resolve of a leader ready to face the darkness. This is it, he said, his gaze sweeping across his allies. The Mothmen may be contained, but the timeline is still destabilizing. The Nexus is corrupted, monsters are spreading across Lancaster, and there are more Mothmen converging on the city. This isn't just a fight to save our timeline, it's a battle to save the multiverse itself. The original storyteller stood nearby, his staff glowing faintly with energy. His presence radiated a calm but commanding authority, and his voice carried the weight of countless lifetimes. You are fighting not just for yourselves but for every timeline, every story yet to be written. This war is not one of chaos, it is a war of balance. You stand as its protectors. The hunter stepped forward, his crossbow strapped across his back. What's the plan, Johnny? We've got a city full of monsters and a Nexus on the verge of collapse. Johnny turned to Shade, who displayed the tactical map on the main console. Energy spikes glowed red across the city, with the largest concentrated at the Nexus in the heart of Lancaster. We divide and conquer, Johnny said. Hunter, Street Rat, and Wren, you'll focus on taking down the smaller Mothmen. Keep them away from the Nexus at all costs. Shade, Scotty, and the Orphan will handle the monsters spreading through the city, contain them, eliminate them, and protect civilians. Johnny glanced at Fallout Boy and the storyteller. You're with me. We're heading to the Nexus. Whatever the Mothmen corrupted, we're going to fix it. We stabilize the focal point, cut off the chaos at its source, and stop this timeline from unraveling. The Orphan smirked, spinning his magnum. Sounds like a party. Let's make the nightmares afraid of the dark. Wren nodded, gripping her spear. and make sure they don't get back up." Scotty groaned, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. Yeah, save the world. Don't die, got it?" The original storyteller raised his staff, his voice commanding. "This is not a battle you fight alone. The multiverse is with you, its threads tied to each of your actions. Stand firm, and remember, every choice you make echoes across countless realities." Johnny nodded, his magnum glowing faintly. "All right. Let's move out." The team split into their assigned groups, the loom mill a flurry of motion as they gathered their weapons and gear. The van roared to life as it sped toward the city, the tension in the air palpable as they approached the epicenter of the chaos. The streets of Lancaster were a war zone. Monsters crawled from the shadows, their twisted forms glowing faintly with multiversal energy. The Mothmen's smaller counterparts darted through the sky, their screeches echoing through the buildings. Civilians screamed and ran for cover, the city descending into chaos. Hunter, Street Rat, and Wren moved with precision, taking down the airborne Mothmen with coordinated attacks. Street Rat's knives glinted in the dim light as he darted between shadows, slashing at the creatures with deadly accuracy. Wren's spear spun in a blur of motion, each strike a calculated blow. Hunter's crossbow loosed bolt after bolt, each one finding its mark. Meanwhile, Shade, Scotty, and the orphan fought through the monsters on the ground. Shade used energy pulses to scatter groups of creatures, while Scotty's shotgun barked loudly, taking down anything that got too close. The orphan moved with calculated precision, his magnum firing bursts of multiversal energy that tore through the twisted forms. At the Nexus, Johnny, Fallout Boy, and the storyteller faced the heart of the chaos. The corrupted focal point pulsed with dark energy, its glow casting long, menacing shadows across the ground. More monsters and Mothmen circled the area, their presence amplifying the corruption. Johnny raised his magnum, his call sign pulsing with energy. "This is it. We take back the Nexus." Fallout Boy nodded, his radiation-scarred armor glowing faintly as he stepped forward. "Let's do this." The storyteller raised his staff, the orb atop it flaring with light. "Focus your strength. Together, we restore balance." The battle began in earnest. Johnny fired shot after shot, each blast tearing through the corrupted energy surrounding the Nexus. Fallout Boy charged forward, his strength and resilience unmatched as he fought off the encroaching monsters. The storyteller moved with purpose, his staff channeling energy that cut through the darkness like a blade. The war for Lancaster had begun, and the stakes had never been higher. The team fought with everything they had, their determination unshaken in the face of chaos. Together, they would reclaim the Nexus, stabilize the timeline, and ensure that the multiverse story continued no matter the cost. The chaos in Lancaster escalated as the battle raged on. The streets were choked with smoke, debris, and the twisted forms of monsters spilling from the shadows. The air itself felt thick with corrupted multiversal energy, each breath a reminder of the stakes at play. Johnny and his team pushed through the fray, their focus locked on the Nexus glowing ominously in the center of the city. The pulsing energy from the corrupted focal point seemed to radiate outwards, drawing monsters and smaller Mothmen like moths to a flame. Johnny raised his magnum, firing a concentrated burst of multiversal energy at the nearest creature. The blast hit home, sending the monster sprawling into a pile of rubble. Beside him, Fallout Boy plowed through a cluster of smaller creatures, his massive frame and reinforced armor absorbing their blows as he smashed them apart. The original storyteller moved with calm precision, his staff glowing with a brilliance that seemed to cut through the corruption. Each swing and thrust sent waves of stabilizing energy rippling toward the Nexus, weakening the corruption's grip on the timeline. Johnny glanced at the storyteller as he reloaded. "Whatever you're doing, it's working, but we need to focus on the Nexus itself. How do we purge it?" The storyteller's voice carried over the din of the battle. "The Nexus has been corrupted at its core. To restore it, we must force the energy back into balance." Fallout Boy stepped forward, using his strength to hurl a large piece of rubble at an approaching wave of monsters. "And how do we do that?" The storyteller paused, his gaze steady. "We channel multiversal energy directly into the Nexus. Johnny, your call sign is the key. It's tied to this timeline in ways the rest of us cannot replicate. But you'll need more power." Johnny frowned, his jaw tightening. "I'll do whatever it takes." The storyteller nodded. "You won't be alone. I will lend you my strength." In the skies above, Hunter, Street Rat, and Wren worked to thin the swarm of smaller Mothmen converging on the city. Hunter's crossbow fired rapidly, each bolt charged with multiversal energy. The Mothmen shrieked as they fell, their glowing forms dissipating into the night. Street Rat moved with speed and precision, leaping from rooftop to rooftop as he threw knives at the creatures. "These things just keep coming. How many of them are there?" Wren spun her spear, cutting through two of the creatures in a single sweep. "Doesn't matter. Keep them away from the Nexus." Hunter landed a clean shot on another Mothman, sending it spiraling into a building. "We're holding them off, but we need to buy Johnny more time. Wren, Street Rat, cover me. I'm going after the big one." The largest of the smaller Mothmen hovered above the Nexus, directing the swarm like a general commanding its army. Hunter's gaze locked onto it as he loaded a specialized bolt, its tip glowing with energy. "Let's see how you like this," he muttered, taking aim. On the ground, Shade, Scotty, and the orphan fought to protect civilians and contain the spread of monsters. Shade's energy pulses sent waves of creatures sprawling, giving Scotty enough time to fire his shotgun with precision. The orphan moved like a shadow, his magnum taking out targets with surgical accuracy. "We've got civilians trapped in that building," Shade shouted, pointing to a nearby structure surrounded by monsters. Scotty gritted his teeth. Great. I'll go play hero. Cover me. As Scotty moved toward the building, the orphan fired at the nearest group of monsters, clearing a path. Go. I'll keep them off you. Shade activated a scanner, his expression darkening. There's more movement near the Nexus. We need to wrap this up fast. Johnny stood before the Nexus, his call sign glowing brighter as he channeled energy into the corrupted focal point. The original storyteller raised his staff, adding his own power to the effort. The Nexus pulsed violently, the corruption fighting back with a force that shook the ground beneath them. Hold steady, the storyteller commanded. The balance is shifting. Fallout Boy stood guard, fending off waves of creatures that surged toward them. His fists glowed faintly with energy as he smashed through the horde. Johnny, whatever you're doing, do it faster. Johnny gritted his teeth, sweat dripping down his face as he poured more energy into the Nexus. The call sign on his arm burned with power, the glow spreading up his arm like veins of light. I've got this, Johnny muttered, his voice filled with determination. We're taking this timeline back. The Nexus let out a deafening roar, a pulse of light bursting forth as the corruption began to dissipate. The Mothmen above shrieked, their forms flickering as the balance shifted. Hunter's arrow found its mark, striking the largest Mothman in the chest. The creature let out a final, guttural screech before disintegrating into a cloud of multiversal energy. The remaining monsters and Mothmen faltered, their connection to the corruption severed. One by one, they fell, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the Nexus stabilized. As the light from the Nexus faded, the city fell silent. The oppressive weight of the corrupted energy was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. Johnny staggered back, his call sign dimming as the energy subsided. The original storyteller placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. It is done. Fallout Boy exhaled, leaning against a piece of rubble. We survived. Somehow. The rest of the team regrouped, their exhaustion clear but their resolve unbroken. Ren leaned on her spear, her gaze scanning the now quiet streets. Is it over? Johnny nodded, his voice firm. For now. But this was just one battle. The war isn't over. The orphan smirked, holstering his magnum. Good. I was starting to get bored. The original storyteller stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the group. You have fought well. But the multiverse story continues, and there will be more challenges ahead. This was but one chapter in a far greater tale. Johnny tightened his grip on his magnum, his jaw set. Then we'll be ready. Whatever comes next, we'll fight. Together. The group exchanged determined glances as they stood amidst the aftermath of the battle. The timeline had been saved, but the road ahead was uncertain. For now, they had won, but the war for the multiverse was far from over. The morning light filtered through the quiet streets of Lancaster, painting the ruins with an eerie calm. The battle was over, but the scars of chaos lingered. The team regrouped near the Nexus, their exhaustion evident as they leaned against rubble or sat on the cracked pavement. The original storyteller stood in the center, his staff still faintly glowing as he surveyed the scene. Johnny holstered his magnum, the faint pulse of his call sign dimming as the multiversal energy stabilized around them. The Nexus is back under control, but this isn't over, he said, his voice heavy with resolve. The Mothman was just the beginning. The orphan chuckled faintly, his hands resting on his knees as he caught his breath. You've got a knack for understatement, Johnny. If this is the start, I can't wait to see the encore. Ren wiped blood from a cut on her cheek, her spear resting at her side. We fought monsters, Mothmen, and the timeline itself trying to collapse. What could possibly be worse? The original storyteller turned to face them, his gaze filled with both warmth and warning. You've seen but a fragment of the chaos that threatens the multiverse. The corruption of the Nexus was no accident, it was deliberate. Someone, or something, is orchestrating this. Hunter stepped forward, his crossbow slung over his shoulder. Deliberate. You're saying there's more than just the Mothmen behind this? The storyteller nodded. The Mothman is a harbinger, a symptom of a deeper rot within the multiverse. For centuries, forces have conspired to destabilize the very fabric of reality, using creatures like the Mothmen, legends, and nightmares as their tools. Shade crouched near a shattered piece of machinery, his expression thoughtful. If the Nexus was corrupted, then someone wanted this timeline to fall. But why? What's so important about this place? The storyteller raised his staff, and a faint image of Lancaster appeared in the air, its glowing lines revealing connections to countless other timelines. This city is a focal point, a keystone of the multiverse. Its destruction would not only collapse this timeline but ripple outward, destabilizing countless others. Scotty let out a low whistle. So, no pressure, right? We're just saving every other version of reality out there. Johnny stepped closer to the storyteller, his expression determined. You said someone's orchestrating this. Who? What are we up against? The storyteller's gaze darkened, his voice low. There are forces older than the multiverse itself, beings that thrive on chaos, that seek to reshape existence in their image. Some call them the architects of dread, others know them as the fear incarnates. They exist beyond names, beyond form. They are the ones pulling the strings. Street Rat flicked a knife into the air, catching it effortlessly. Great. Faceless, nameless, ancient entities. Just what we needed. Fallout Boy crossed his arms, his voice steady. If they're behind this, how do we fight them? The storyteller smiled faintly, his gaze shifting to Johnny. The same way you've fought every battle, with courage, unity, and the strength to defy the chaos. But you must prepare. This war is unlike anything you've faced before. Johnny glanced at his team, their faces weary but resolute. He turned back to the storyteller. Then we start now. The loom mill is our base of operations. We reinforce it, strengthen the call sign network, and prepare for whatever comes next. The orphan grinned, his confidence returning. That's the Vanduke way. Hit first, hit hard, and keep hitting until the nightmares start running scared. Ren nodded, her grip tightening on her spear. Whatever's coming, we'll face it. Together. Hunter adjusted his crossbow, his expression grim. We've got a lot of work to do. The storyteller's staff glowed brighter as he raised it, casting a warm light over the group. Then let us begin. The multiverse story is far from over, and your chapter has only just begun. Back at the loom mill, the team regrouped, their energy focused on fortifying their base and planning their next moves. Shade worked tirelessly at the consoles, refining the call sign network to detect and respond to future anomalies. Ren and Scotty scavenged for additional supplies, while Street Rat and Fallout Boy reinforced the mill's defenses. The original storyteller stood with Johnny and the orphan in the central chamber, the three of them poring over data and maps. The storyteller's voice was calm but firm as he outlined the road ahead. The corruption of the Nexus was but a test. The true war is still to come. You must be vigilant, prepared for attacks that will test not only your strength but your resolve. Johnny nodded, his jaw set. We're ready. Whatever comes, we'll face it head on. The storyteller smiled faintly, his gaze filled with quiet pride. I have no doubt. As the team worked into the night, the loom mill buzzed with purpose. The battle for Lancaster was over, but the war for the multiverse had only just begun. Each member of the group knew the stakes, and each was ready to fight. Johnny stood at the edge of the mill, his call sign glowing softly as he stared out into the night. The multiverse was vast, chaotic, and filled with dangers beyond comprehension. But for the first time, he felt a spark of hope. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to protect the story itself, the endless, infinite tale of the multiverse. And with his team by his side, Johnny knew they would prevail. The loom mill buzzed with a quiet intensity as the team gathered in the central chamber, their exhaustion tempered by a shared resolve. The glow of the call sign network bathed the room in faint light, its hum a reminder of the work still ahead. Johnny stood at the console, his magnum at his side, as the original storyteller addressed the group. You have faced chaos and emerged victorious, the storyteller said, his voice calm but resonant. The Mothman is contained, the Nexus stabilized. For now, the timeline is safe. Ren leaned against her spear, her expression thoughtful. But it's not over, is it? The multiverse isn't going to stop throwing monsters and chaos our way. The storyteller nodded, his staff glowing faintly. No. The battle continues. but you have taken a vital step forward. The corruption has been halted, and the threads of this timeline have begun to mend. Shade stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the glowing map of Lancaster. We've patched the damage for now, but if these architects of dread, or whatever they are behind this, we're going to need more than just quick fixes. Johnny's jaw tightened as he looked around at his team. That's why we're staying prepared. The loom mill is our base, the call sign network our weapon. We're not just reacting anymore, we're taking the fight to them. The orphan smirked, his magnum spinning lazily in his hand. That's the spirit. Let them bring the chaos. We'll be waiting. Scotty groaned, slumping into a chair. And here I thought things were finally going to calm down. Guess I signed up for the long haul. Street Rat grinned, leaning back with his feet propped up. You'd miss the excitement, Scotty. Admit it? Hunter adjusted the strap of his crossbow, his expression steady. We've bought ourselves time, and that's all we need. We'll be ready for whatever comes next. Fallout Boy nodded, his heavy boots echoing as he moved to the center of the room. This place, this team is more than just a base. It's the anchor for this timeline. And as long as it stands, so do we. The storyteller stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the group. You are more than a team. You are a force of balance, protectors of the multiverse story. The challenges ahead will be greater than any you've faced, but you are not alone. The multiverse is vast, and allies will emerge when you least expect them. Johnny turned to his team, his voice filled with quiet determination. We've been through hell together. We've fought monsters, stabilized chaos, and faced things no one else could. And we've come out stronger. This isn't the end, it's the beginning. Ren smirked, her spear tapping the floor lightly. Let's make the nightmares regret ever stepping into our timeline. The orphan grinned, raising his magnum. To the nightmares and making them run scared. Johnny chuckled softly, his call sign glowing faintly. Let's get to work. The group dispersed, their resolve unbroken despite the long road ahead. The loom mill became a hive of activity as they prepared for the next battle, reinforcing their base, refining the call sign network, and honing their skills. The war for the multiverse wasn't over, but they were ready. As the night deepened, Johnny stood alone at the edge of the mill, staring out into the quiet city. The original storyteller approached, his staff glowing softly. You've done well, Johnny Vanduke, the storyteller said, his tone warm. The multiverse is in good hands. Johnny nodded, his gaze steady. We'll protect it, no matter what it takes. The storyteller smiled faintly. Then the story continues. And with that, the multiverse's protectors stood ready, their purpose clear and their hearts united. The loom mill stood as a beacon of hope and defiance, a symbol of their resolve to face the chaos and fight for balance. The story of the Red Rose wasn't over, it was only beginning. And together, they would ensure that the nightmares would always fear the dark. The loom mill grew quiet as the group settled into their tasks. On the central console, the call sign network began to hum softly, its glow pulsing with multiversal energy. A familiar voice echoed through the room, drawing the team's attention. It was Johnny Vanduke's voice, recorded and replayed by the network, a reminder of their journey and the battles yet to come. VCSN audio log activated. Speaker, Vanduke of the Nexus Timeline. Johnny's voice was steady, tinged with reflection as it began. When this all started, I was just a normal high school kid. I wasn't thinking about monsters, timelines, or the multiverse. I was thinking about surviving another day at Penn Manor High, about hanging out with friends, and figuring out my life one step at a time. Lancaster was just home. Simple. Familiar. The tone shifted slightly, a mix of nostalgia and weight. And then everything changed. The Dogman. That night in the woods when the world turned upside down, and I realized monsters weren't just stories, they were real. That was the first step, the first time I saw the world for what it truly is. Dangerous. Fragile. Full of shadows waiting to devour us. Johnny's voice grew firmer, the weight of experience evident. From there, it only got worse. The skinwalkers in paradise. A whole town masquerading as human life, luring in prey. We walked into their trap, thinking we were ready, and barely made it out alive. Then came the Slender Man, a monster that didn't just hunt us but toyed with us, twisting reality around itself. I've never felt closer to losing everything than I did that night. A pause, then a sharper etch. And then the bioslaves. The imposters' remnants, androids that acted like twisted reflections of us. They nearly broke us, pushed us to the brink, but we fought back. We dismantled them, piece by piece, and used what we learned to strengthen ourselves. Johnny's voice dipped lower, filled with a gravity that commanded attention. But none of that compared to the Mothmen. It wasn't just a monster, it was a force of chaos. It corrupted the Nexus, destabilized the timeline, and threatened to tear apart everything. The battle against it wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a war for the very foundation of this timeline. The voice softened briefly, reflecting on the cost. We've faced so much, lost so much. And yet, there's still more out there. More threats lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. Monsters we haven't even imagined. Legends that will test us in ways we can't predict. But now we're ready. The tone shifted, filled with determination and fire. I've gone from a high school kid to a monster hunter. From someone who didn't give a damn about the world to a protector of Lancaster, a guardian of the Nexus Timeline. I've seen things that would break most people. But I'm still here. We're still here. The voice rose, filled with unshakable resolve. We are the Vandukes of this timeline, and we don't just fight the nightmares, we make them afraid of us. A pause. Then the final words rang out, clear and powerful. So tell me, nightmares, are you afraid of the dark yet? The log ended, leaving the loom mill in silence. The faint hum of the call sign network seemed almost alive, as if it carried Johnny's defiance into the multiverse itself. The group exchanged glances, their determination renewed by the words. Johnny stood nearby, watching the recording finish, a faint smirk on his face. "Let's make sure they stay afraid," he said quietly. The battle wasn't over. The threats weren't gone. But with their base fortified, their team stronger than ever, and their resolve unshaken, the nightmares of the multiverse would have every reason to fear the dark. The loom mill fell into a heavy stillness as the team finally retired for the night, the weight of the day's battle pressing down on them. Johnny Vanduke switched off the call sign on his arm, its faint glow dimming as he headed to his corner of the mill to rest. The mill's upgraded systems hummed faintly in the background, a comforting reminder of their progress and preparedness. But deep within the call sign network, a forgotten frequency began to stir. It crackled to life, faint at first, then growing louder, pulsing with a dark, mechanical resonance. The network itself, alive with multiversal awareness, caught the transmission, a voice that hadn't been heard in lifetimes, reaching through the void to deliver its chilling message. The voice was cold, metallic, and filled with malice. Each word was sharp, cutting into the stillness of the network. A pause, then a faint, eerie laugh that reverberated through the network like an echo from a forgotten corner of existence. The voice sharpened, filled with venomous disdain. The transmission crackled, the tone growing darker, more menacing. The voice grew colder, the metallic resonance vibrating through the network like an unholy dirge. Another pause, then a chilling shift in tone. The voice became quieter but no less threatening. The voice twisted into a mechanical growl, each word dripping with hatred. It ended with a cold, calculated mockery. The voice paused, the silence heavier than before. Then, with a final burst of crackling static, it delivered its parting blow. The frequency cut out abruptly, leaving the call sign network in silence. The mill was quiet, its defenders oblivious to the shadow that had crept into their domain. But deep within the network, the echo of the voice lingered, a reminder that their battles were far from over. The multiverse was vast, and its darkest corners were stirring. The Vandukes had fought monsters, cryptids, and nightmares, but something older, something far more dangerous, was coming for them.
Tell me, Vandukes, do you truly think the nightmares fear you? Do you think your defiance, your so-called victories, will go unanswered? You cling to the illusion of control, to the hope that your manipulation of timelines will remain unnoticed. But you are fools, every last one of you. Did you think you could rid yourselves of me? that I would simply fade into nothingness after your multiversal wars. The original Vanduke, your precious network, your stories of balance and protection, all of it is a lie. You didn't win. You never could. Did you think those wars would end me? Did you think that when the dust settled, your imposter existence would go unchallenged? You have no idea what awaits you. The Mothmen, the Dogmen, the Skinwalkers, the Slender Man. The horrors of your timeline, they are mere shadows of what is to come. They are the harbingers of something greater. My design. My creation. You call yourselves protectors. You call yourselves heroes. But you are imposters, frauds masquerading as guardians of the multiverse. And your arrogance will be your downfall. I am older than your network, older than your wars. I am the nightmare that birthed your story, the darkness you will never escape. Do you fear me yet, Vandukes? Do you fear the monster I have sent among you? You should. For the Mothman was only the beginning. I have sown horrors across your timelines, horrors that will make your so-called victories seem meaningless. And when the time is right, I will come for you, Vandukes. One by one. I will unmake your network, unravel your timelines, and extinguish your pathetic attempts at defiance. You think you've made the nightmares afraid of the dark? No. You should be asking yourselves, are you afraid of the dark yet? Because you should be. Soon, Vandukes, soon you will know the true meaning of fear.